Prisons at breaking point. A crisis inherited, the Prime Minister repeatedly insists. The only option, radical action.
I can't tell you how shocked I was when I discovered the full extent of what they've done with our prisons. And it's going to take time to fix it.
Letting thousands of convicted prisoners out early, politically and publicly for many unpalatable, defended with alarming warnings of the alternative.
If we fail to act now, we face the collapse of the criminal justice system and a total breakdown of law and order.
But government knows only too well there are risks here on many fronts. The party started early outside Wandsworth Prison in southwest London this morning. Perhaps not the pictures the Prime Minister had hoped for to illustrate such a controversial decision.
You know, I can't express to you how bad it is in there. I wish I could.
In nearby Brixton, Stephen Quinn is one of the 1,700 prisoners who were released across the country as part of the government's plan. A long history of drug addiction has seen him in and out of jail for 27 years, this last conviction for commercial burglary. If he feels lucky to be out early, he seems certain that luck won't last.
When people come out, they need help, miss. You know what I mean? And we ain't getting that help. A man walks out of prison with a duffel bag, £86 in cash. Well, where's a man going in life? You know, I'm saying go to probation. What am I going to do when I go on probation? I'm going to go probation, I'm going to sit there, I'm going to get bored. I'm going to start going back into my old ways. Maybe I might smoke drugs again, I'll go out, I'll start committing burglaries at night. Next thing you know, I'll be back in jail. Because this is what happens. I'm being honest, I've got not much faith in that sense. Every time before I've been recalled. So I ain't got much hope this time. This is only for the government's benefit we're all being released. Most of us will be back within 28 days, yeah.
Nearly 300 miles away at HMP Humber in the middle of the East Yorkshire countryside, a welcoming hug for some. Others must rely on a prison van to take them to freedom, whatever it holds. Like prisons up and down the country, HMP Humber has released significantly more prisoners today than normal. At the best of times, prisoners are often released homeless into the care of an overstretched probation service. But right now, probation faces almost as big a crisis as the prisons. Too few staff, critically too few experienced staff, and now this huge jump in workload. The risks? Prisoners reoffending and being recalled to prison, defeating the object of the plan in the first place, or worse, harming someone in the process. For many victims of domestic violence, today is one they've been dreading. Although the government excluded domestic abuse, sexual and serious violent offenders from the scheme, those with a history of abuse may have been released today if they still had time to serve on a lesser offence. Campaigners fear many of their victims may not know their perpetrator walked free today.
I think it sends them the message they've been receiving for a long time, which is that they are not central to the concerns of the criminal justice system. I understand that government is between a rock and a hard place at this point, but it certainly means that victims are paying the price for failures in decision-making, failures in the system, and they're paying the price for what now is a crisis in our prison capacity.
Prisons like Wandsworth, hugely overcrowded, filthy and violent, are simply warehousing people in squalor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons said in his annual report today. It's why governments say they've been forced to accelerate an early release scheme started by their Conservative predecessors. But they insist they did give time for everyone to be ready.
We're pulling every lever I have at my disposal to do this in as safe a way as possible. But I'm afraid when you're in a position where you're about to run out of prison places, I think we just have to acknowledge that that alternative is terrible for the country, and everything that we have to do to get us away from that is also going to be difficult.
Now we have to roll up our sleeves and change our country.
While he listens to the Prime Minister at the TUC, the head of the probation union wonders if the government is listening to them, describing the early release scheme as a ticking time bomb, which could put the public at risk.
Is the probation service ready for this?
I'd say not really. We are suffering from the workload issues I've mentioned. We are suffering from huge vacancy rates across the country, the probation regions. and we have a mixture of highly experienced staff, many of whom deciding that enough is enough and are taking retirement, and obviously new trainees who we welcome, but are taking one look at the chaos and thinking this is not for me.
Back in Brixton, Stephen Quinn leaves the prison behind. An early out, but will it be a permanent out this time? Stephen isn't the only one needing that to be the case. The government's strategy depends on it. Well, to discuss today's prisoner release, we are joined by Charlie Taylor, who's the Chief Inspector of Prisons. Charlie Taylor, I mean, the government said it had no choice. Is that right?
Yes, we were in a situation where they simply had to release people from prison or stop sending people to prison. It wasn't palatable, it wasn't possible to stop sending people, so they had to release some people early.
I mean, of many devastating reports you've produced over the last couple of years, today, by chance, is one of the worst, your annual report. Many prisons just warehousing people in squalor, brutalising conditions that are fundamentally undermining any efforts to reduce reoffending. How does releasing prisoners today help any of that?
Well, it at least helps the immediate pressure that the government has faced over time. But ultimately, this is a much longer task that prisons face. I mean, in your video just earlier, you were showing pictures of Wandsworth Prison. That was one of the most squalid prisons that I've ever been around when we inspected it at the beginning of May this year. And so there is a huge way to go where you've got people, as I said, warehoused in what are really appalling Victorian conditions, often worse than Victorian conditions, because you've got two prisoners sharing a cell that was originally designed for one person.
I mean, part of the problem is, if you look at some of the detail in your report, this whole scheme looks doomed to fail on so many fronts. Your report today says prisons across the board are failing to offer inmates purposeful training. They're failing with basics like teaching them to read, with education, with training. So today we're seeing many prisoners not fit for the outside world.
Well,
How can this work?
Well, that is the great frustration that we've had in the inspectorate recently. It is the lack of purposeful activity that we see within prisons, the amount of empty workshops we go to, the amount of empty classrooms we go to, the failure of prisons to be able to get prisoners out from the wing and into the sorts of education and training that is going to help them to resettle when they come out at the end of their time.
But all of that makes reoffending, as many of them admitted today, not just a possibility, but actually likely.
Well, certainly, and certainly the preparation for release that we are often critical of, where prisoners are not, don't have anywhere safe to live, where they're not linked in with things like a GP practice, they're not getting mental health needs sorted out, they're not being supported with things like substance abuse. The danger then is for many prisons, as the prisoner being released from Brixton talked about, prison just becomes a revolving door where prisons return within days who are caught in this cycle of mental health difficulties, of drug misuse and of crime, and prison just becomes a second home for some of them.
And exactly, leading on from that point, it's equally critical what happens to the prisoners when they get out. We know that significant numbers of prisoners are released homeless. Today, they leave a crisis in the prisons and walk straight into a crisis in probation. The Probation Union today describing the early release as a ticking time bomb with the risk it could cause public harm. That's right, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I'm in little doubt that a number of those prisoners who are released today will be back in prison within a week or so. There are not the number of people in the probation service.
It defeats the object of the scheme, though, doesn't it?
Well, sadly, we will see some prisoners commit further offences, but also other prisoners simply will breach the terms of their licence condition, and particularly those who are leading very chaotic lives, particularly those who are going out from prison homeless. A number of those will be very quickly back inside again.
So what is the point of this scheme? I mean, it is clearly not a long-term solution. Many people would argue it's not even a short-term solution to the crisis.
Well, it is, we hope, will take some pressure off in the short term. And from the inspectorate's point of view, that has to be a good thing, that some of the pressure that we're currently seeing in prisons with staff absolutely stretched to the limits of their capabilities and their time. It has to be a good thing. But in the longer term, there are some more difficult decisions to be made. The government is unlikely to be able to build enough prison spaces even to be able to cope with the capacity that's projected to come through within the next 3 or 4 years. So there are some difficult and potentially unpalatable decisions that need to be made over the next couple of years or so.
But history has shown us that political parties in power don't like to have that conversation, do they? They don't like to have a conversation which says maybe we should be sending fewer people to prison. Do you think this government is ready for that conversation?
Well, let's wait and see. In the meantime, we've relieved the pressure on the crisis in the short term, but over the next year or so, we'll see how this plays out. And the danger, of course, is that we're facing another prison population crisis in a year or two.
I mean, obviously, prison at its core is supposed to actually be about victims, about preventing reoffending so that prisoners don't leave and reoffend. There will be many victims today. We heard the Domestic Abuse Commissioner in the piece say that some victims are paying the price of this system collapse. I mean, do you accept that? Do you worry about reoffending and more people being harmed by this scheme?
Well, if you have prisons like Bedford, like Wandsworth, where prisoners are locked in their cells for 22 hours a day in what are often unsanitary conditions, where they are exposed regularly to high levels of drug abuse, where they're not doing anything meaningful at all with their time, the danger is that any sort of rehabilitation that might take place is simply fanciful, and that people will come out from prison, that reoffending rates currently are 37%, and the danger is they will come out from prison and then very quickly they'll come back in again. But in the meantime, they will have created more mayhem in their communities and more victims of crime.
Charlie Taylor, thanks very much for talking to us this evening.